Hello, welcome to our webinar on demystifying the cost-benefit analysis. I'm Laura Papard. I'm the Deputy Director for Treatment and Prevention at the Washington-Baltimore HIDA. We understand that there may be some new people on this webinar today. We've been offering this series since about February of this year, but we did notice a lot of new names, so I wanted to share with you a little bit of the background on why we're offering this series. ADAPT is actually the division offering the series, and ADAPT stands for Division for Advancing Prevention and Treatment. ADAPT is housed in the Center for Drug Policy and Prevention at the University of Baltimore, but the purpose of ADAPT is truly to serve as a training and technical assistance provider for substance use prevention across the United States within HIDAs. For those of you who don't know what HIDA stands for, it stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. There are 33 HIDAs across the U.S., and we currently sit in the Washington-Baltimore HIDA. Over the last year or so, we've been providing technical assistance to a variety of different HIDA communities. And as a result, we decided that one of the best ways to maybe open this up a little bit and share some of what we've been experiencing with these HIDA communities is to deliver a technical webinar series. The focus of the series is on substance use prevention fundamentals, and we have covered a variety of topics, including program planning, evaluation, risk factors, protective factors, persuasive messaging, and a couple others. We have a couple more to come, so stay tuned. Patty Fischbein will be sharing that information with you. But today, we wanted to focus on value. The purpose of what we do at ADAPT and our identity really is to serve as a translator. So what you'll find in all of these technical webinars is that we try to break down with our presenters the concepts that are being addressed into relatable and digestible pieces. When I say relatable, I mean relatable in language so that the language is familiar to you. It's not fancy academic terms. It is something that you can easily absorb and apply moving forward. Also that it's relatable in experience so that the examples being used by the presenters are something that are familiar to you as well and something you can relate to and start to picture, operationalizing that concept within in your own community. We also encourage the presenters to break down the concepts into digestible pieces. And what we mean by that is that oftentimes these concepts, like value, are complex. They can be complicated, they can be multidimensional. And I think that really rings true for our concept today. But that said, you're in for a real treat. Our presenter, Dr. John Roman today, he is truly one of a kind when it comes to breaking this down. We've had an opportunity to get to know him a little bit better and to hear how he thinks through value. What you'll hear today really is a little bit about those multiple dimensions, and he will spend a little bit of time touching on that. But what's really neat is he's going to provide you a tool. He's going to help you dive in to the cost-benefit analysis and really embrace it as a tool that you can use and integrate into your way of working within the prevention space. You'll find by the end of the webinar that hopefully you're feeling extremely comfortable with carrying forward, if not one component, many of the cost-benefit analysis. And I'm hoping that you'll also find that you are better able to articulate the value of the work that you're doing in prevention. One thing that I think is really important to stress here is that value means something different to different audiences. So while you may be presenting to your community, or you may be presenting to one particular organization, or even one individual, you'll want to adapt your concept of value. You'll want to tailor it and adapt it to what's meaningful to that audience. And I think that Dr. Roman does a really good job helping you do that. So that's the goal of today's webinar. I have a few thank yous I want to throw out before I turn it over to our next speaker. I really want to thank Dr. Patty Fischbein and Dr. Rebecca Bates for joining us today. They are two of our ADAPT team members. Dr. Patty Fischbein has coordinated this entire technical webinar series, and it would not have happened without her. Dr. Bates will be filling in for me today. She'll be handling the Q&A session, and I hope that there will be a lot of questions submitted in your chat box. And so the last two people I want to thank are obviously our presenter, Dr. John Roman. He is volunteering his time to do this, and he finds this extremely important, as we do. And so he's one of our tribe, and I think someone that just has immersed himself in studying this particular subject. And so I thank him for that. And finally, I'd also like to thank Dr. Denny Fischbein. Dr. Fischbein has been instrumental in securing all of our subject matter experts for this particular series. And without her, we probably would have found some people, but I think that the ones that she's chosen have been spot on and incredibly informative. So thank you to her as well. Patty, I'll turn it over to you at this time.
Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping items on how you can participate on the webinar today. So what you will see here on your screen is a screenshot that shows the interface that you see on your screen. This is the audience interface. And we want to draw your attention to two areas on the screen. Below the presenter image, you will see a little box that says Ask a Question. We will be stopping at different time points throughout today's webinar and really encourage you and are really hoping that we'll be able to have an active discussion. So please submit any questions, thoughts, or remarks into that Ask a Question box. Just type it in and push Enter, and it'll get submitted to us. And then we will respond as appropriate. Below the Ask a Question box is an area that says Resource Supplement. What you can do there is just click on where it says Event Resources, and you will see a resource supplement that is downloadable. Just select on that, and it'll download and open up a PDF that you can have. In that resource supplement includes some information on ADAPT as well as NPSC and the slides from today's presentation and a few web resources to further your understanding and knowledge around this particular topic today. Finally, we want to let you know that when the webinar ends, you will automatically receive an evaluation. We do ask that you take just a moment or two to complete that evaluation, and once that's completed, it will go ahead and automatically email you with a link to download a certificate of completion today, which does come with 1.5 continuing education credits. Lastly, if you have any tech issues today, feel free to contact us at one of the phone number or emails that are presented on the screen at this time so that we can go ahead and get that out to you. Within a day or two after the event, we'll also go ahead and send you a link that includes access to the recorded webinar should you want to come back at a later time and have access to today's event. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. John Roman. Dr. John Roman is a senior fellow in Economics, Justice, and Society Group at NORC at the University of Chicago. Dr. Roman's research focuses on evaluations of innovative crime control policies and justice programs. His research focuses on the economics of crime in juvenile and adult justice systems, focusing on prisoner reentry, diversion and alternative sentencing, and justice system interactions with substance abuse, adolescent development, workforce development, and education. Dr. Roman's work also includes studies on cost-benefit methodology and public-private partnerships. He's conducted research on behalf of numerous federal agencies, as well as state and local governments and foundations. Dr. Roman's also the co-editor of two books, Cost-Benefit Analysis and Crime Control and Juvenile Drug Courts and Teen Substance Abuse. He's also the author of dozens of scholarly articles and book chapters. We're very excited to have him join us here today. Welcome, Dr. Roman.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. I hope you all. My video bridge went quiet, but I assume that all is well. It's a pleasure being here today. What I want to talk about is this topic of demystifying the cost-benefit analysis. I think that cost-benefit is really an important construct. It's something I've been studying for 25 years. I wrote my dissertation forever ago on the topic of the price of crime to victims, which sounds super dry and sounds like a way to devalue people when it's actually sort of the opposite. And that gets to the point of cost benefit, which is that if we understand more accurately what the harms are to victims, then we know how to appropriately apply the optimal amount of resources to prevent crime, to intervene in crime, and to use the justice system appropriately. So it tends to be my view of the world that we undervalue victimization and that we should invest more in preventing it relative to some of the other things that we spend government money on. As to the method itself, I really don't think that it's terribly complicated. I think that we think about it as being something different from other types of evaluation, when in fact it's just simply a little tweak on the evaluation that you all probably have undergone in all sorts of settings. So that's the goal today. So the housekeeping, the Patty talked about, the technical support numbers here. The email address is here. If you have any troubles, they're going to help you find solutions. Okay. So I want to do this in 3 parts today, and we'll stop after each one, give you an opportunity to ask questions. I love the Q&A part of these things more than the presenting part of these things. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you feel like you have, and I'm happy to answer them. I want to start with the value of prevention and talk about why we undervalue the whole topic of prevention as a way of introducing the cost-benefit concept. And then I want to talk some about the actual role of cost-benefit in decision-making at the policy level, and then talk about specifically how you can add cost-benefit to your toolkit. Now, the way this is structured, the intention here is that by talking about the value of prevention at a very conceptual level, not an abstract level, but a conceptual level, that we introduce all the concepts that are important in actually conducting a cost-benefit analysis, because cost-benefit is, as a method, what makes it valuable to you, to your stakeholders, to the people that you support, are the well, I don't want to say value, it's tautological, but the concept, the logic of what you do and the logic of how you frame that, the resources that you use and the value of it, the benefits of it, much more than the math or the jargon itself. So I don't want to get caught up in all that stuff. So I want to just sort of talk about it, talk it through. And then hopefully the idea is when we get through the first 2 sections and we get to the 3rd section, there's actually nothing new is added in that 3rd section. It's simply a synthesis of everything that we've already talked about. And then you'll find that to be pretty straightforward. All right. So what's the value of prevention? So I should define prevention. So I think the most important thing to say about prevention is that it's the removal of risk conditions that when we think about the criminal justice system and prevention, we have a tendency to say that what we're trying to do with the criminal justice system is to prevent crime. And really, that's not quite right, because by preventing something, you remove a risky condition that's usually a context or setting or structure more than it is an individual behavior or activity. So if you want to to prevent something from happening in the future, and you want to change a structure or a system, then you're really engaged in prevention. If you want to change an individual's behavior, their decision-making, then what you're really doing is an intervention or a treatment. And so we tend to confuse the two, and we tend to have a lot of interest in funding treatment and not as much interest in funding prevention. Prevention, I'll talk about why that is. But I think what we've recognized is that governments alone, nonprofits alone, and markets alone, none of them can by themselves address the social ills that we want to solve. That social ills themselves are not hurdles. They're not individual events. They're not something that happens to you that you recover from, and then you go on the path that you were on originally. What they are really, they are barriers to your achievement. And that the thing about these barriers is that they are sort of life course altering. They put you on a different path, and often a lower path where the ceiling for what you can achieve and all the things you can accomplish personally are reduced. So the root cause of the lack of mobility, of people's ability to find themselves on a better path, is really what we call an opportunity deficit. And I'll describe in a second exactly what I mean by that. But what prevention tries to do is to remove these structural barriers so that, you know, the individual obstacles that you confront along the way, along your course, are obstacles and not barriers. They're something you can get over and get by, but they aren't something that diverts you onto an entirely separate path. So when we talk about prevention, what we talk about doing is trying to reduce this opportunity gap, because many of these structural barriers are things like deep poverty, or concentrated disadvantage in the place that you live, structural racism. These are all things that create a gap, that create barriers, that put you on this alternate path to a lower quality of life. And the thing about it is that this isn't sort of one thing. When we think about treatment, we think about interventions, we tend to think about there's this one thing that is in your way at that time, and we want to remove that obstacle and get you back onto the course that you were already on. But opportunity, the things that prevention tries to solve, are much more complicated than that. They are, as was said earlier, they're multidimensional, and they're things that are insidiously interrelated. I promise to avoid using jargon here, but what I would say is that the way academics think about this is they think about a concept called endogeneity. And you know this concept as what you would call sort of simultaneity, which is just that two things happen and the two things sort of cause each other. And it's really hard to figure out which one is the cause and which one is the effect. Or you're in a situation where you think one thing causes another, and it turns out that it's reversed, that the effect was really the cause, and the cause was really the effect. And when you have multiple systems and multiple dimensions, and it gets really super complicated, evaluation sort of breaks down, and it's really hard to say, well, we did this thing, and this good thing happened, when all the causes and consequences are all interrelated. And what prevention does is it takes a step back from all of that, and it gets you out of this sort of entanglement, this mess, this endogeneity, this confounding, by sort of saying, look, if we just remove this structure, this system, this barrier, this set of obstacles, then we get you onto a different path where we don't have to worry about all those causes and consequences being intermingled. And so that's really the value add of poverty, of prevention. Sorry, I was thinking my next point, which is to say that the big risk conditions tend to emerge in childhood. And these are experiences of poverty, of instability, of trauma. And they have all sorts of consequences that affect all of the really important early developmental issues around school and social and emotional skills. And the problem with these early childhood issues and obstacles is that they cascade throughout the life course. So early childhood problems become a lack of attachment to school in adolescence, social isolation in adolescent, risky behavior, drinking, drug use, those sorts of things. And then all of these problems then cascade into adulthood, where all these early adverse experiences lead to chronic poor health, obesity, disability. Obviously, lack of school attachment leads to low educational attainment. You don't do as well in school. You're at higher risk of use disorders. Your attachment to the labor market is disjointed, where what I say is you work a job rather than pursue a career. And all of this puts you at risk for all sorts of other problems. Like I said, it all cascades. Chronic diseases such as heart disease and diabetes, that could be as a result of the lifestyle risk factors that are associated with all these obstacles in your way. But it can also be place-based problems too, lack of access to healthy food and opportunities for exercise, and then the trauma of the stress experienced in childhood. So the big structural problems, really can't be ameliorated one at a time. They have to be addressed as a whole, and the way to address it is through prevention. So that's the value of prevention, really. And And one of the ideas I think that really resonates is that these problems don't just cascade from childhood into adulthood. They can actually affect your neural pathway. They can change how you think and how you process information. And that those changes in your neural pathways can then affect your genes. And then you can actually literally pass along to your children the consequences of the stress and trauma that you experienced. So we have recent literature that shows that gene expression can be passed on generations. And then you have this sort of built-in barrier to success for a whole generation. So these opportunity gaps persist. So the value of prevention is in addressing these gaps. Prevention itself as a term is really challenging. We go up to Capitol Hill once in a while and we talk to the legislators about prevention science. And I've literally been asked several times, oh, so you want to prevent science? We say, no, of course not. We want to promote science, and we want to promote the science of prevention. And so we've really tried hard to change our language around prevention and try and use words like opportunity and to talk about prevention as a mechanism for shared prosperity. The science of prevention comes from the fact that it's evidence-based and that it's data-driven and that it creates opportunities and it reduces risk conditions. So there's little controversy that evidence-based prevention can reduce costs and improve outcomes at the population level. I think, ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We've all heard this, sort of the Ben Franklin maxim from 250 years ago lives on. I think everybody hears that and accept it and they acknowledge it. But actually, in terms of affecting policy and practice, it's hard to see it put into place. And the reason for that is that because we're talking about risk conditions, we're talking about population level problems. We're talking about problems that affect everybody in a place. And if you're a legislator and you're trying to find something to put your weight behind, some policy or program or bill to advance, those kinds of programs really aren't all that appealing, because when you talk about them, you can't talk about your constituent. You can't say, oh, I implemented this program and John Roman got a job because of that, because it affected it was the tide that raised all the boats. But because it raises all the boats, it's really difficult to see. So cost benefit analysis is a tool to expose some of those benefits. It's a way to give them visibility. It's a way to shine a light on those kinds of things. Washington State Institute of Public Policy is a terrific example of this. They began this program in 1989, and the idea was that the legislature wanted a data-driven research organization that was part of the legislature itself, that would inform and advise the legislature on things that the legislature could pass that would have benefits that outweighed the cost. And what they tried to do that really makes it exceptionally valuable was they focused on creating portfolios of programs. We talked earlier about how all these problems are interrelated and endogenous and the causes are shared. So the solutions have to be shared too. You have to create a portfolio of programs that are evidence-based, data-driven, and cost beneficial in order to solve multiple problems at once. So let me show you what they come up with. It's really cool. So you can go to WISIP and find this for yourself. It's small, but the details aren't sort of as important as the sort of gestalt, the whole picture. What they've done here, this is just a cut and paste, a snip from the juvenile justice evaluations that WISIP has run through their benefit cost model. And what they've done is gone through each one of these different areas of demonstration programs, pilot programs, and then program evaluations. And they've summarized all of the literature across each one of these areas. And some of these areas have dozens and dozens of studies, and some just have a handful. And they've said, what are the total benefits from doing these programs? What are the costs of doing it? What's the benefit minus the costs, right? Costs are in red, benefits minus the costs are in green. And what's the benefit cost ratio? And what's the risk? What's the chance that if you implement this program, that one particular program will have benefits that outweigh the risk? And so you end up with this, and this is rank ordered by the benefit cost ratio of all these prevention. These are mainly prevention programs in the juvenile justice space. And what you see is just tremendous returns on investment, right? You see, $5 and $8 and $10 return on investment because they're prevention programs. You would never see that kind of benefit to cost ratio for adult programs. But they're pretty common in the prevention world. And because of all these benefits are spread out over a lot of people, you don't see it when you look out at your community and look at big data about how well your place is doing. You have to kind of look at the programs themselves. So this kind of benefit cost thinking exists out in the world and can be replicated in other communities. The MacArthur Foundation and Pew Charitable Trust implemented a program called Results First. You can look up Results First. And they essentially went to, I think in the end, 24 states and helped them to implement a model like the WISIP benefit cost model that the states can then use to help create portfolios of prevention and intervention programs of their own. So this is catching on. We're still sort of early days for this, but this kind of thinking is really where the future is headed. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about why I'm really optimistic about where this whole cost benefit thing is going, and why I'm optimistic that we'll do more data-driven, evidence-based policies and programs 5 years from now than we do today, and even more further down the road. So why is evidence so undervalued? I think evidence is undervalued because of the way the procurement process is structured. It's structured in a way that makes it really hard to implement prevention programs. And I think we can change that. I think the way to change it is just to sort of shine a light on it, hold a mirror up to it, and reflect back, look, this is the Biden, regardless where you stand on Biden. I like this quote, show me your budget and I will show you your values. I think that's exactly right, regardless of the partisan politician who's saying it. Policy is about how dollars are distributed across programs. You might have an ideology, you might have a strategy, but at the end of the day, the rubber hits the road by what you're willing to spend your money on. And that tells you where your priorities are. The problem is that programs are about how much they're funded, are about who they serve and who serves them, right? Budgets tend to fund people with a track record, so we tend to fund the same people over and over, regardless of whether what they're doing is evidence-based, regardless of whether it could be tweaked to become evidence-based. It's about who we know, where the dollars flow, and what the programs cost, and who the target audience is. I think it says here who they benefit, but it's even more specific than that. Who's the target audience? So governments contract with programs and they buy what we call outputs, not outcomes. And what that means is that they want to put their money into a program and say, this program serves 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people. And we know that it's going to spend $10, $100, $1,000 per person, and that's what government wants to buy. The problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't put any primacy on outcomes. We don't know how well these programs do, right? We just know what they do. We don't know if what they do is effective. And it turns out that most of what government does, I'm not going to say it's not effective, it just doesn't have an evidence base behind it. It's not predictable in the sense that if you've done an evaluation of something, you have a pretty good idea, like in that WISIP data table that I showed you, you have a pretty good idea what the likelihood is that that particular program is going to return a benefit on each dollar in investment. Obama's budget director, Peter Orszag, when he first started, before he was even engaged in the business of governance, right at the beginning of the administration, said that their review found that less than 1% of government programs are evidence-based. Now, again, that doesn't mean that less than 1% of government programs work. Of course, that's not true. We just don't know going into them how well they work. And because we don't know how well they work, we don't know if there's something else out there that would work better to serve the same population. And I always say people always say governments are risk averse in the sense that they don't want to do new things. And that's true to some extent. It's true in the sense that governments like to fund and like to procure with and contract with people who they've done business before because they have an expectation about how well it's going to go. But in the sense that governments don't know exactly what the outcomes are going to be for all those services they buy, you could say government is really risk loving because they're investing in all these things and they can't be sure how well those programs will do. So governments know what they spend, but not what they buy. And the other problem on the prevention world, and this is something that we see all the time, is somebody will go out and do a demonstration or pilot program, and they'll believe that if the pilot program is successful, that it will grow into a full-fledged evidence-based policy. And I think that they won't. Let me give you a quick example. And the quick example you all may be familiar with, which are drug courts. Drug courts came around in the early 90s, and the idea there was that almost everybody who had a substance use disorder was being treated by going to prison rather than getting treatment. And so, drug courts have fallen out of fashion in the last 5 or 10 years. But the idea of moving people from prison to treatment, I think, was obviously the right thing to do for people with use disorders. And the federal government invested a little bit of money. They made a little bit of funding available for counties to start to stand up a drug court with the idea that if it worked, then the drug court would grow and serve a higher and higher percentage of people who enter the court systems who are at risk of drug use and dependence. And what happened was the courts sort of stood up with this new federal money, and then they became whatever size they were at the start, and then they stayed there forever. They never grew beyond that, even though many, many of them had really positive evaluations. We did a study, University of Maryland did a study and estimated that maybe 1 or 2% of people who would be eligible and benefit from a drug court actually get drug courts. They don't scale. Programs don't tend to scale. If you want to change something, you have to change the policy. That's another reason to like prevention. Prevention is about policy change rather than trying to implement some programs and hope that they grow, because they don't tend to. So I said that I would talk about why evidence is going to be more valued over time, why I'm super optimistic about this world, why I'm optimistic about the value of benefit cost analysis. I think it's important to think about the big picture. I'm told, I have no way to measure this, but I'm told that more data is created every 2 years than in the entirety of human history. I'm told for people who worry about their privacy that on any given day, it is theoretically possible for the NSA, for the government's data spy agency, to collect more data in a day than all the computers in the world could process in a year. So we're creating enormous amounts of data. The amount of data that we're creating is growing. The marginal cost of analysis is declining. The Moore's law that the processing speed of a chip doubles every 18 months continues to be true. And government is finally, I like this, getting hip to this change. Government is finally acknowledging that the amount of data that we have access to could really inform better policymaking. So in 2019, President Trump signed the 2018 Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which created a chief data officer in every federal agency and created ways for agencies to share data. National Secure Data Service is coming. Evidence Act Part 2 is coming. So evidence from all of this is rapidly going to accumulate on outcomes and what we actually do on the ground. What are the causal mechanisms that lead to an outcome? So there's going to be more and more data and research to guide our policy making and the choices we make about how to spend our resources. Okay, I'm going to try and pause here. There we go. Oh, hi, Patty. It's the first time I've been able to see you. Do you want to stop here? This is a little break. We can ask questions.
Yes, this is a great breaking point. So audience, we do have one question that has come in. So audience, please feel free to submit additional questions. One of the things that you will notice is that we provided in the Ask a Question box the link to the WSIP site that Dr. Robin referenced. So if you would like that link, it is there. It is also in the resource supplement within the slides and the references slide. So those are two ways that you can find it. The question that came in was a curiosity about whether school-based programs are also perhaps included on that WSIP site or some other site similar. So you demonstrated and you showed an example screenshot of juvenile justice programs. Yeah. So the audience member was curious about things like the PACS Good Behavior Game, Triple P, Too Good for Drugs, yeah, and whether they would also be included or if there would be another site that you might know of where folks could get that information.
Yeah, I mean, WSIP's great. I don't want to give people too many sites. There are a number. So let me answer that question. Let me say something else. So to answer that question, yes, WSIP has evaluated all of those programs. Triple P, Good Behavior Game, the benefit cost numbers on these are just, astronomical. I mean, Good Behavior Game is essentially, as close to costless as something could be. It has a little opportunity cost, which I'll talk about in a minute. But yeah, there's a whole education section. Education more than justice tends to have high benefit cost ratios. Justice-based programs are very costly. Even though all those juvenile justice programs have high benefit to cost ratios, the actual cost of doing something like multi-systemic therapy or something else for really high-risk adolescents can be $15,000 or $20,000 or $25,000 a year. They're still worth it. They still have big benefits. Education programs tend to be just a fraction of that cost. You can do really effective prevention programming for, hundreds of dollars a kid rather than tens of thousands of dollars a kid. So I think that that's true. The justice stuff, the substance use disorder treatments, these tend to be more expensive, and it makes sense, right? Because education, a lot of the kids just need a little nudge to go in the right direction. Kids experiment. You want to keep that experimentation from becoming a habit, right? That's a different setup than somebody who has a dependence issue or goes so far down the funnel that they're actually adjudicated delinquent and involved in the juvenile justice system, which suggests a much higher risk juvenile situation. So, yeah. So, and all of this stuff is, the evidence, like I said a couple slides ago, is accumulating rapidly. And we know more and more about what works, and our portfolio of things that we can do that is data-driven, evidence-based, and cost-beneficial is growing really rapidly. Oh, last thought. Sorry. It's a great question. Do a whole presentation on that question, right? And there's so the other thing that's really changing is that there's a whole bunch of efforts at both in the nonprofit sector and in the government sector to create systematic reviews, meta-analysis, to create places that have a WSIP-like accumulation of evidence of studies. Blueprints for Violence Prevention is one site. And then most of the agencies in the federal government have something specific to their work. So the Department of Justice has crimesolutions.gov, which they've literally done meta-analysis on. Last I looked, it was over 100 different kinds of programs with, a few to dozens of evaluations underneath that where they rate them in terms of their effectiveness. But WSIP really does the best job of anybody in terms of translating it into a cost-benefit ratio. Okay.
Thank you. We actually just do have a couple of additional questions, but I did also, as I was playing around with the WSIP site, notice that there's a public health and prevention tab where all of those programs are listed. So folks can also venture there. Somebody was curious, and maybe this is out of concern that it may not last indefinitely as a resource, how WSIP is sustainably funded. And do you have any idea?
Yeah, so it's funded by the legislature. So I almost said Washington State has a weak governor. and I don't mean it the way it sounds, it's not pejorative. It is constitutionally set up that the legislature has a lot of power and the executive has very little power. Normally, this would be something you would see in an executive branch. If you think about the federal government, the Office of Management and Budget is very equivalent to WISIP. The Congressional Budget Office, which scores every piece of legislation, is a different kind of thing. Most states have something like that, and they just sort of say, what's going to be the effect on the budget if we do this legislation? Will it cost more than we get in tax revenues? WISIP's just a different thing, right? WISIP's a policy-making entity. The state legislature recognized that there was a gap in their knowledge, that they had to think beyond the budget, and that's something I want to encourage everybody here to do. I'm going to talk about return on investment and what that means in a little bit, because really narrowly construed, that's a Congressional Budget Office question, right? Will this raise enough new taxes to pay for whatever outlays we have in the budget? That's a perfectly valid question. But government is in the business of fixing market failures. It's in the business of fixing externalities, of breaking up monopolies. These are the things I think everybody on the political spectrum agrees the government should be doing. And all those have an effect on social welfare and all of our well-being that goes well beyond whether, what the tax implications are. And WISIP does that, and it's really laudable.
One final question, Dr. Roman, before we transition on. And this is referencing some earlier comments that you made in the presentation. A question is coming in around, do you think that trying to establish causality, such as with logic modeling, is passé or wrong-headed at this point of prevention science? Curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Wow, so if the other question was something I could do a seminar on, that's something I could teach a whole course on. So I understand where that question is coming from, I think. I'm a big believer in causal mechanisms as being critically important. I think we do a lot of things. I spent a lot of my professional life going everywhere. I'm working with a government in Eastern Europe right now, and have done this all around the world, where in that place, they're fighting corruption, real big picture corruption, right? And they have all these programs there. And literally what I'm trying to do with them is to get them to think about what the programs, what they cause to change, what they really think by doing this, what will happen as a result, what the outcome of that is. What is the causal mechanism that is in that program? And you would be astonished, probably 85% of what they do, they cannot identify a causal link. They cannot say why it will lead down the road to less corruption. So I think at the end of the day, we do a lot of things that sound good, that are intuitive, that match our priors, that, we all talk about confirmation bias. We all like things, including me, that show that things that we already thought were true are yes, in fact, true. But that doesn't help us with the big problem that we have, which is the problem that cost benefit tries to solve, which is there are just scarce resources. Government only has so many dollars. I'm going to talk about this later too, and there's competition for these dollars that is intense. If you want to help people, you want to, work on the pandemic, that's COVID. If you want to work on the pandemic, and that's fentanyl, you're competing with the COVID pandemic, and then you're competing with the violence epidemic, and then you're competing with infrastructure, roads and bridges and sewers and rural access to internet and blah, 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 blah. And if you can make a claim that the thing you want to do will cause a change, you go to the head of that list, because almost everybody else doesn't have that tool in their toolkit. So I think there's a practical reason to do it. You want to do things that work, or at least you can demonstrate are likely to cause the outcome you care about. And you want to compete in this marketplace of ideas in the budget. And it's a great way to stand out.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. Those are all the questions for now.
All right, so let's talk about what value. You can see the slide, yes? Okay. So what value does cost-benefit analysis add to decision-making? And that sounds sort of silly and simplistic, but the big question here is to say, look, we just talked about this. Policymakers make choices. They make it for all kinds of reasons. What does a cost benefit contribute above and beyond other things in that marketplace of ideas? So I think of cost benefit analysis as a second generation tool, where the first generation is, what works, right? Can this social problem be prevented? It's a second generation tool that says, what's the most efficient solution? And the most efficient solution has a very specific economic meaning. Something is more efficient if the benefit cost ratio is higher, if it returns more dollars in benefits per dollar invested than something else, it's more efficient. And I think as the weight of the evidence accumulates across all policies and programs, like what we see in WISIP with a public health tab and the juvenile justice tab and a tab for everything, there's going to be more competition here. And it's not simply going to be enough to say, I can show you that this program works. I have an evaluation that says this can work. You have to say it works and it saves money, and that's more than these other things we could do with that same dollar save. I know that sounds, in a moment where all the debates are just intensely ideological, it seems sort of silly to say that choices get made that way. But in my experience, they absolutely do. When it's time to solve a problem, the best solution is gonna win in a time of crisis. And I think there's plentiful examples of that. So the conceptualization of cost benefit is really the critical next step. And by that, I just mean understanding the logic of it. So I want to spend a little bit of time in this section talking about the logic of cost benefit analysis. So when we get to the last section, which is how do I do a cost benefit, we've actually already answered all the questions. Sorry. Okay. So first, why compare cost to benefits and not cost to something else? XXX is just a placeholder. It could be cost effectiveness, return on investment, cost utility analysis. I see all these things. So I think cost benefit analysis is the most intuitive way to present information about the economic returns from investing in a policy or program, because it puts everything into a single metric. Everything's in terms of dollars. If you do a cost effectiveness analysis, you're quantifying the cost, but not the benefits. You're saying it costs me $1,000 to reduce relapse rates by 10%, right? And then when I'm comparing that to some other program, I don't really know what the value to society is from reducing relapse rates by 10% versus improving commuting times by 10%. I have no mechanism to compare those two things. The other thing that it does that I think it's really important, and why I encourage people to avoid it, is it creates a lot of precision on the cost side. We know that this will cost $2,437. The benefits are kind of vague, right? And so that tends to center people's thinking about, wow, the costs are this, can we afford that? And then the benefits just become something, that becomes less important and the focus becomes on the cost. And that's never the right answer. We talked about multi-systemic therapy, costs $20,000 per kid. It is absolutely worth doing with high-risk adolescents. Cost shouldn't matter. What should matter is that ratio. Return on investment is a little dicey, right? Because it's good if it's broad, and it's a little dangerous if it's super narrow. If it's super narrow and it's just what I talked about a minute ago in answering that question, it's just about the returns to the Treasury. Will we raise enough additional new tax revenue because of this to pay for the program? I think that misses the point, right? We talked at the beginning, I went through 5 slides talking about all of the effects of not doing prevention in terms of, multi-generational issues and effects on community and effects on individuals that cascade from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. And so to think about, solving those problems in terms of, do the tax revenue go up? Even though all those things cause tax revenue to go up, I think just misses the point, which is that we have a market failure. There's no incentive for the market to invest in prevention. It just doesn't exist. We're always going to underprovide it. So if return on investment is more about, what are the benefits to cost, and you think about it in a benefit cost sort of understanding, and you call it return on investment, which is appropriate to me, I think that's great. But I don't want people focus on tax revenues. I love CBA. It's super flexible. There's a lot of jargon in the next clause, so let me break that out. As flexible as the inferential statistician or data scientist can conceptualize it. All I mean by that is, at some point, when you do a cost-benefit analysis, you almost have to do it in conjunction with some sort of program evaluation. You have to understand, you have to isolate the effect of your program and see if it affects the outcomes that you care about, controlling for all the other competing explanations for why that outcome changed, right? So that's what your inferential statistician is doing, and that's it. As long as you do that well, and there's a million ways to do that, your cost benefit can fit into it, right? You don't need to do something, you don't need to do that program evaluation work and then do a cost benefit. That's the secret sauce I'm going to talk about at the end. You do the program evaluation and you just change it a smidge and it's a cost benefit. And that's why there's no mystery here. That's why it's simple. Okay, sorry, I did that the complicated way. Okay, so what's the real role of cost benefit analysis in decision making? So government doesn't know what they buy in terms of outcomes, right? We talked about that. But they know what they spend, and they're always making cost benefit analytic choices in choosing what to spend the dollars on. Everything's in competition: crime control, education, health, transportation. All of this stuff is being competed at the budget level. When the Biden administration came in, I know tons of people who got, reached out to the transition team in one way or another, and they all said the same thing to the new administration, which was the same thing they said to the Trump administration, which was the same thing they'll say to the next administration, which is, my problem cuts across every cabinet agency, and you need to create a work group or something within the Domestic Policy Council that brings together all of these agencies across government to solve my problem, because my problem is that important. But they all said that. And now they have to choose. This administration, the last administration, they had to choose which of those things were the priority. So let me tell you how it's supposed to go. We all know it doesn't go this way because we live in a political world, and that's okay. But I think it's really important to think about how it should go, because if you can make that case, ultimately it will win out over a long enough period of time. So the idea is to say what government really cares about is what happens to the next dollar that gets spent. What we call the marginal dollar is the extra dollar, the next dollar, right? So if we spend one more dollar, would the benefits from doing that be more or less than any of the alternatives that you can think of? This is essentially the cost benefit calculation that governments, that policymakers, decision makers make. And then they put into the political calculus, and whatever happens, then happens. But this is really how they think about it. So the real secret to cost benefit analysis is you are simply replicating in showing how effective your program is in a benefit cost way. You're simply mirroring the decision process that policymakers are going to make when they decide whether to fund it or not. It's the same process. You're just saying it to them first, which is really advantageous. Okay. Let me just say two quick things about two jargony things. So the two most important jargony ideas that cost benefit brings to the table that program evaluation does not are the idea of externalities and the idea of opportunity cost. Externalities being the most important when you talk about prevention. The thing about prevention is, because it's designed to remove a risk condition that helps everybody affected by that risk, right? It's not a one-to-one transaction. It's not like if I get somebody into a treatment program and they get into recovery and that recovery is sustained, their wages go up, their health is improved, their healthcare costs go down, et cetera. Prevention isn't like that. Prevention's like the other thing that happens when you get somebody successfully into recovery, which is that, yes, their incomes went up. Yes, their healthcare costs went down, but their family experienced less turmoil and trauma, and maybe their incomes went up and their healthcare costs and their mental health care costs went down. Maybe by working, there is an absolute truism in economics, which is there's a multiplier effect. If you get a job and earn $1, the total amount of money created by that job is like $2.20, because you're having that job has all sorts of consequences on suppliers and consumers and taxes and all of these different things. These are all externalities. And they're really important in understanding prevention. So I think that the main argument for prevention is that underfunding prevention and not removing risk conditions creates a market failure. It's a result of a market failure. And that when you correct it, and you want to know how much to correct it, you have to measure all the costs and benefits. And the way you measure all those costs and benefits is not just for the people who are directly affected, but from the whole place, the whole community, all of society. You include those externalities, and then you know what to invest in the prevention program to ameliorate the risk condition. So let me give you an example. So suspend your disbelief. Imagine that a pharmaceutical company or companies invented a synthetic substitute for heroin. Just imagine such a thing. And imagine that the price of 1 unit of that synthetic drug reflected only the cost of manufacturing and the profit, and not any of the costs that accrue to society from having that synthetic in the marketplace. That people lose their jobs, they don't take care of their families, they become sick. Premiums go up for if they have health insurance, everybody pays for uncompensated medical care. They commit crimes to get money for drugs. They die, become disabled. We all know that this list is terribly incomplete, right? There's a whole list of things that happen. None of these costs of harms were included in the price of the prescription, right? It's exactly analogous. It's exactly analogous to a manufacturing plant that produces some good, some widget, and in the process spews filth into the air or gunk into the rivers. And people get sick from the gunk and the bad air, and they get sick and they lose their jobs and they have bad health care and they're disabled or they die. You would say, wow, those externalities are absolutely obvious, but the exact same thing happens in this when synthetic opioids are introduced into the marketplace. So some of these harms accrue to the users, some to the community, to their community of family and friends, some to the community at large beyond their families and friends. For the opioid, we have the consolidated opioid case. And so there's been a lot of work on that case in understanding what the cost would be to mitigate those harms, what the pharmaceutical companies would have to do to repair the damage that they've caused. I would argue that that's a really inefficient way to understand the externalities from something like this, because it's going to underestimate what the harms were. And the easiest thing to do is to force it to be in the original price. If the harms associated with synthetic opioids had been included in the price of the opioids at the day that they went to a pharmacy to be sold, they would have been so outrageously expensive, the entire epidemic would have been avoided because the harms are of that magnitude. So shouldn't we apply the same logic, structural barriers to opportunity? So we understand what the externalities of prevention are from the positive spillovers. I've talked about unintended negative consequences, the filth in the air, the sludge and the gunk in the water. There are also positive spillovers from prevention, right? I talked about the multiplier effect from employment. We talk about better health. There's productivity gains that go along with that. When there's reduced crime, there's reduced victimization. There's all sorts of harm and trauma associated with victimization that we do a really poor job of measuring and putting the appropriate price on. I talked about the intergenerational effects. We don't talk enough about the community effects. That's its own complicated subject, but poisoning a place has all sorts of detrimental spillover effects, and improving it has all sorts of positive benefits, quality of life, et cetera. So I think of prevention as a public good, and we should fund it that way. Almost done with the section. So so that's the externality bit and why externalities are super important. Let me just say two or three slides real quick on opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is something else that you get from a cost benefit analysis that you don't get from a program evaluation. Most cost benefit studies take an accounting approach. So back in the 1870s, when I studied cost benefit, that's a joke. When I studied cost benefit, they would show you the letter that Ben Franklin wrote to his friend who was having trouble making a decision. And Ben says, the way I make decisions is I write down all the positive things that would happen from that decision in this column in my ledger, and then all the negative things that would happen in this column in my ledger. And then I go and I find a positive thing and I try and find a negative thing that's of the same size and I cross them out. And when I'm done crossing them out, I total what's left over, and it lets me know if the benefits outweigh the cost. Essentially, that is what most benefit cost analyses do today. They just simply sum up the benefits and sum up the cost and subtract. And they miss a bunch of ideas. I just talked about externalities, but they miss the idea of opportunity costs. So, cost benefit analysis explicitly considers opportunity costs as the use of a resource by valuing it in terms of its next best use. I remember learning this in graduate school and thinking, wow, I don't know what that means. So what does it mean? What it means is that we apply this idea of opportunity cost all the time, right? And one classic way you do it is you put in your head at all times, you have an implicit value of working or not working. We all work at home now. So I think the implicit value of an hour of leisure has gone way up. The TV is right over there. I can go put it on CNN or ESPN or whatever. And that seems really positive to me. So maybe I value my leisure a little bit more than I used to, or I could go outside. But generically, you take 40 hours a week, and for 40 hours a week, you say the cost of the hour of my time is more for me to work. The value of my time is more if I work than if I don't work. I engage in leisure. And you probably take your hourly rate and you think, whatever it is, $15, $15,000. Is it worth an hour of me going and hitting golf balls on my mat into a net? Is that worth $15 or $15,000? And for 40 hours a week, it's not. But after 40 hours a week, it absolutely is, right? And that's how you make that trade-off. That is implicitly using the value of opportunity cost. So the problem with opportunity cost comes along when you have a government agency that pays people to do something, and you ask them to do something they weren't doing before, and you want to figure out, and so you're not paying any new money to do this thing, but the opportunity of their cost of their time is real. Example I would give is I did a study of the cost of the death penalty, and I went to prosecutors and I asked them how much time they spent on a death penalty case. And they said, we spend blah, blah, blah on a death penalty case. And I said, okay, I will multiply that by the amount that we pay those attorneys per hour. And that's the cost of a death penalty case. And they came back to me and they said, John, you are absolutely wrong. You don't get it. I didn't have to hire any new attorneys. It didn't cost me anything. And I said, in my head, I said, no, you don't get it. You're wrong. But I didn't say that out loud. What I said out loud was, okay, but your attorneys can't do two things at once. There was some other case they weren't working on while they were working on that death penalty case. And that case had value, right? That had a victim too who cared about justice. And so there is a real opportunity cost of that time. So what you get from a typical evaluation is a baseline understanding of what the program did compared to what nothing, essentially, is what we tend to do. And what I'm saying is, cost benefit shouldn't do that. Cost benefit should say, okay, let's think about what we did in this new program that we care about, that we want to evaluate, that we want to do a cost benefit analysis compared to what we would have done with that money and that time. Drug court example is when I started in the business in the late 90s looking at drug courts, the alternative to drug court was jail. By the time I sort of wrapped up that portion of my evaluation career in 2010, the alternative to drug court was almost always drug treatment. It was usually community-based drug treatment. It was definitely AA, NA. It might have been a 28-day program, but everybody got a little bit of something, right? So that had value. And in fact, what that did was it meant that the cost of a drug court was less in 2010 than it was in 1997, because the alternative, the opportunity cost, was no longer zero. It was now something. When you subtract that from the cost of doing the program, it's now small. Okay, so I'm going long on this section. I'm going to answer some questions, but here's the good news. Good news is this. The good news is we've now done all the difficult method thinking. I'm going to tell you how to do a cost benefit in the next section, and it's going to go really fast because we've already done it all. All the hard work is behind us. Now I'm just going to show you how to put it together, and we don't have to introduce any new concepts or any new jargon or explain any of it. We just apply things that you now know. So, do we have any questions at this point?
Folks, please submit some additional questions if you have them before we move into our next section. We do have one question that came in a little while back. And this speaks to, again, just how you help sort of different organizations and agencies with understanding the value of prevention. Specifically, the question was recognizing that funding comes into communities oftentimes, and many times there are requirements in school programs and school systems to deliver prevention programs. And the question is really about how do you help motivate schools to allocate time for prevention, recognizing all of the other competing demands. And really this could be extrapolated beyond the school system to other systems as well, where you're trying to promote this same sort of argument.
It's another great question. And it's actually something I think I addressed just a little bit in the next section. So schools, I don't know about your school, but my kids' school had a raging debate about whether the time between periods, the transition time for them to move from one class to another, should be reduced from 6 minutes to 4 minutes, because across 8 periods of the day, that extra 15 minutes was seen as incredibly valuable for some sort of, pedagogical purpose, right? For some sort of educational purpose. So schools certainly see every minute of their day as extremely valuable, and they see the opportunity cost of that time is very high. And so you have to convince them that using that opportunity cost is something that should be paid for prevention versus, geometry, right? So that's the trade-off you have to make. What I would say in response to that, if I had a school administrator in front of me who was trying to noodle this through, I would say, look, the biggest impediment to learning and the biggest challenge to school systems is that the kids bring with them every problem of their home and their community to school, and educators are perennially frustrated that they can't solve those problems, and thus but they're held to a standard of educational achievement that presumes that those problems get solved in schools, and of course the school can't do it, right? So what prevention allows you to do is to solve some of those problems in ways that help the kids do better in all their other classes. It's like a complement to everything else that you do during the day. If you do some prevention, then every hour you spend doing something else actually is worth, having done an hour and 10 minutes of it instead of just doing an hour, because you've got the kid in a slightly better place to be able to benefit from that other kind of education. So I think that would be my message. Okay, let me wrap this up. So this section will go super fast. So what is cost benefit analysis? How do we do it, right? And so you're thinking, wow, you should have spent the whole time on this, but I really honestly believe that the conceptual, the logic that we went through lets you do this really fast. Okay, so this is the way we do it. Cost benefit analysis is a way of reporting heterogeneous outcomes. Heterogeneous just means variable. They vary across people and places. Using a common measure dollars, there's 3 steps. You count all the cost, right? You want it to be opportunity cost. You want in-kind time, volunteers, anything that costs you to do something that somebody else would have to pay for if they replicated what you're doing should include as a cost. Then you identify all the outcomes that have changed due to the intervention. that the program caused the change, back to that causal mechanism question from earlier. You identify all the outcomes that were caused to change by the program that you're studying, and then you translate all those outcomes into dollars. That's what a cost benefit is. What are the requirements for cost benefit beyond the Ben Franklin cost accounting madness that so many people do? Cost benefit, if you're going to do it right, requires that you specify a counterfactual and opportunity cost. So we've talked about this, right? Counterfactual is just the business as usual, what you would have done if you weren't doing the program, what you would have spent the money on if you hadn't done the program. And you include that in the model as a deficit. And then you count all of the benefits, and you consider all these things jointly in a single model. So what does all that mean? Most of the work of the cost benefit is done before you get to this step, right? This last step where you put everything together, right? What you've done is you've thought about all the concepts of the prevention program that you've put in place. You understand the logic of it. You understand why you think it changes outcomes. You've thought about what else you would have done with the dollars. You've thought about what benefits happen because of this prevention program that accrue directly from the program and indirectly from all these positive externalities, all of these spillovers, right? We've talked about all prevention cost benefit analysis are at the population level, and they have these intentional spillovers. And we think about, we take a step back, and we don't have to think about things that you would in a Ben Franklin model. In the Ben Franklin model, you can get really hung up on some stuff, right? In our model, what we've said is we understand what the costs are fully, and we understand whether our program or policy caused a change in the outcome we care about. If you did the Ben Franklin model, you'd have to then say benefits to whom? Benefits to participants, benefits to the government, benefits to everybody. In the prevention world, you don't have to care about that. Prevention is population level. It's always benefits to everybody. This is why I said earlier that return on investment isn't the right way to think about prevention cost benefit analysis, because it affects everybody. And if you're just thinking about the return on investment within the government, you've ignored a bunch of the benefits of the program, right? You've underestimated the effects. So all people have standing in a prevention cost benefit analysis. That's also an important point, especially when you talk about HIDA, justice involved dependence. Most cost benefit analysis ignores the implications of a policy or program on the person who receives the program. So if you say it like that, you go, that's insane. You're going to tell me about the cost of doing the program, but not for the person who receives it. And that's normally what happens. And the way it works is this. If I'm in a drug court and we think about what's the cost of the drug court, we think about the cost of the treatment, we think about the cost of the judge's time and the attorney's time and the treatment coordinator and all these people's time. And we think about the benefits in terms of, is recidivism reduced? Does this person commit fewer crimes or fewer people harm? And what we completely ignore is for that person, their time spent in that program has a cost. There are other things they could be doing with that time. And you say, well, the justice involved, maybe doesn't have the same meaning for them because, the alternative is going to jail. But that person in that program is going to make that calculus. All these programs are voluntary. They're going to make a choice. Do I want to do the hard work of going to treatment, or do I just want to take my jail time, be done, and get on with my life? They're making that calculus. Your cost benefit should make it too. Prevention makes it easy. You automatically give them standing. You automatically care about their costs and benefits. The last thing that you might worry about is the time horizon, right? So the problem with all this stuff is prevention is all about changing somebody's life course trajectory. It's all about getting somebody on a better path, not just a better today, but a better path so that all days are better, right? Not every day is going to be better, but the whole trajectory is better. I think it's reasonable to do that in your cost benefit. I think at the end of the day, policymakers are not convinced by arguments that rest on things that are going to happen a long time in the future. I think the nearer term you think about a year or two, the more engaged people who have to write a check are going to be about those consequences. But either way is appropriate. Okay, so let's put it all together. So the way to conduct a CVA is to answer all these conceptual questions as you undertake your program evaluation, your impact evaluation, or your outcome evaluation. So your impact evaluation has a study design that isolates the effect of the program, whether it's a school-based program or justice system-based program. It isolates the effect of the program so you can say it was this program, not these other things that caused this outcome to happen, to have this better thing happen than would have happened without it. That impact evaluation measures the program's effects, and it says, people get this program do 10% better, they do 50% better, they do 200% better, whatever it is. That's what your program evaluation does. What your cost benefit does is just simply takes that same equation, that same math, and just turns it into dollars. Now, here's the secret sauce. The secret sauce is to ignore costs and benefits. So what I'm going to tell you to do is to do a cost benefit analysis, but not to count the costs or the benefits, because I think it's a lot easier and it's a lot more meaningful. Secret sauce. Best cost benefit analysis, ignore costs and benefits. Outcomes, I'm going to read through this and then I'm going to say it again because it's just a totally different way of thinking about this. So I want to make sure it gets through. The best cost benefit analyses ignore costs and benefits. Outcomes are measured in terms of the resources they consume or the resources they create. You say, my program helped somebody stay in recovery 6 months longer, right? And then your cost benefit analysis says, okay, what is the value of maintaining recovery for an additional 6 months? We can measure quite a lot of that, right? We can measure what that means in terms of wages. We can measure what that means in terms of healthcare outcomes. We have studies that can say what those two things mean for the community, that you worked more and more productively and enjoyed it more, and you were healthier, what that means for the community. We have studies that can help you understand what those benefits are for your family from having been healthier and happier. And we can turn that into a dollar figure. When you think about justice involved, TIDA, justice involved, a lot of it, not all of it, a lot of school-based stuff too. But when you think about justice-based stuff, and even a lot of education-based stuff, a lot of what these programs do is they work with the riskiest kids. Kids who are consuming a lot of resources, right? If you go into the justice system, it's unbelievable the resources that go, the money that is spent on a kid in the justice system. A really high-risk kid in the educational system is having an unbelievable amount of money spent on him relative to the average kid. And what most of these programs do is they reduce the extra amount that goes to be spent on these kids, right? So instead of spending $10,000 extra on the kid, now we're spending $5,000 extra on the kid. That's a big win. That's a big win because the opposite side doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense to say, I don't want to spend more on kids, right? The whole point of education is to spend an appropriate amount on kids and to say, well, I get a kid to stay in school and now he's in school an extra year. And, oh, we don't want to do that because I got to pay the teachers to teach him and it's $25,000 per school year. And that kind of logic is nuts, right? Nobody's going to have that kind of logic. So thinking about it in terms of what we spend, is that a cost or is that a benefit, gets super confusing. Is keeping a kid in school and spending more money on him, is that a cost or a benefit of something? That doesn't make any sense. What makes some sense is to say, if that kid had been in school and been in trouble and been as far behind as he was before with all of the special help that he needed before, and now he needs less of that, then you can put that dollar amount into your cost benefit analysis and you can run the same model that you ran before. And what it'll tell you at the end of the day is, by doing the program, it cost us $2,000 less per kid. And you get out of this whole mess of saying, you know, I spent more money on a kid because he stayed in school, and what does that mean, right? You put it all together. I spent $2,000 per kid on $1,000 per kid on this program. I got $2,000 in better outcomes for this program. You put it in the same program evaluation model you used before, and it'll say for every kid in, you save $1,000, and it'll give you a confidence interval around it. And what a confidence interval does is that's the plus or minus, right? Confidence interval says we're going to save $1,000 per kid, and we're going to recognize that kids have very different experiences, right? Some kids will benefit 3,000, some will benefit 300. And the confidence interval says we're going to save on average $1,000 per kid, plus or minus $500, right? That is so much more valuable to a policymaker than if you bring to them, we're going to save $2.31 for every dollar in cost. Because they're going to look at you and they're going to say to you what they say to me all the time when I bring them that number, which is, I don't know what the real number is, but I know it's not $2.31. And if you can give them a confidence interval and say, it's $1,000 plus or minus $500, either way, totally worth the investment, that's going to be a compelling message. Okay, so let me just sum it up. Everything that we said. This is actually, I had a whole thing to work through, but I think we've worked through a bunch of stuff, so I'm going to skip this. Let me just sort of sum it up and say this. I really think that what the value of a cost benefit is over and above a program evaluation is that it allows you to understand the logic of what you're doing in a deep way that you don't necessarily get from a program evaluation alone. It allows you to communicate in dollars to an audience of stakeholders and policymakers who care enormously about dollars. So now you're speaking their language in a way that an effect size or some other program evaluation calculus doesn't communicate to them. And you've got an answer to all of their questions. Well, what else would I have been spending the money on? Well, how does this spill over to the community? Are there any unintended consequences? You've already thought through that logic. You've got answers because you had to have the answers to do the analysis. So it's really an effective way of understanding your program and communicating it to the world.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. We do have a few questions that have come in, and folks, feel free to continue to submit them so we can get to them today before the webinar ends. So one of the questions has to deal with your previous discussion around how sort of government may appropriate dollars across competing priorities and how much relative dollars may go towards prevention versus other alternative and perhaps even more costly, lower benefit, seemingly lower benefit programs. So the idea here specifically was that given the government seems to recognize the value of prevention, in particular vaccines and treatments in medicine, then why is it seemingly so easy to justify more costs put towards potentially comparatively lower benefit programs such as law enforcement, prisons, maybe even treatment, et cetera, as compared to more focus on prevention?
Great question. I would argue that, so when anybody talks about prevention, it's extremely natural to talk about vaccines as the ultimate example of it. And most vaccines are, right? When you get measles, mumps, and rubella, you're not anticipating an outbreak of measles, mumps, or rubella. You're just laying the groundwork that if it ever comes up, you're covered, right? When we talk about the vaccine in the context of COVID, we really weren't thinking about it that way. We were thinking about it as the intervention. This is how we're going to solve this crisis, this pandemic. I think we funded it not because it was prevention. I think we funded it the way we funded it because it was an intervention. And I think it is, in fact, yet more evidence of how we prioritize interventions over prevention. It took us a year or less to develop these vaccines, right? We have a new one, Novavax is about to be approved. So we have a fourth effective vaccine in a year where the typical vaccine takes 10 years to develop. Why is that? Because we thought about it as an intervention and we were willing to fund it. It's not like any of this was, novel coronaviruses were not a surprise, right? We've known about this threat for 2 decades and we didn't prevent it. I think there has to be a whole huge change in mindset. It's so self-defeating that we spend so much money solving problems after they've occurred rather than preventing them in the beginning. National Prevention Science Coalition, that's our little logo on the bottom left. Dr. Denny Fischbein is the director. This is what we work on, is trying to create messages to take to Congress to get them to understand that prevention message. And, we're still working on it. It's an uphill battle. It's just the world that we live in.
Thank you. One of our viewers is hoping that you could say a little bit more about measuring unintended consequences.
Yeah. Unintended consequences are not inherently unpredictable. I think that's the key insight. I think most consequences were not, if I'm trying to think of a good one on the fly, I can give you a positive one. Positive one on the fly. Way before we had OnStar, any of that stuff, they developed this thing called LoJack, which was essentially a transmitter that you put in your car. And if your car was ever stolen, it got activated, and the cops would go to where your car was with the guys who stole it and arrest them. Cool. And the unintended consequence was it made all car thefts go down, because unlike the club or any of the other crime prevention technology we had at the time, your car thief couldn't see it. They didn't know which car had it. So every car looked riskier to them. So they stole fewer cars. There's a paper written on this right at the time it came out that argued this was completely predictable. And anybody who thought about it for 5 minutes would have seen this coming. And then what Congress should do would be to fund LoJacks for everyone, or for 10% of the population, because that would probably be enough to wipe out all car theft for everybody. So it's just simply a matter of going through the logic exercise and thinking about, what the British call the knock-on effects. What happens next, right? I go into recovery. Okay, well, what happens next? Well, I feel better. I go to work. Well, what happens at work? Well, I'm probably not only go to work more, I'm probably more productive, right? Well, what happens next? Well, my career trajectory improves. Maybe I go back to school. Maybe I get a better job. Maybe all of these things are predictable just by sort of thinking through the logic of it. It's very rare that something comes out of left field that turns out to be really important.
Thank you. And that actually concludes our questions. So I really want to thank you tremendously, Dr. Roman, and thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Folks, please keep your web browsers open. Once the webinar ends, a post-presentation evaluation will pop up. We'd love to get your thoughts on what your experience was like with the webinar content today. Please keep in mind that somewhere in about 24 to 48 hours, you'll receive an announcement email that includes details with how you can access the webinar and resources, again, following today. Also want to let you know, you should have already received, hopefully if you're on our distribution list, an announcement for our next upcoming webinar on Tuesday, June 23rd at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That will be specifically on the CDC's Understanding Evidence Framework, and that is being offered by 2 CDC colleagues. So on behalf of the ADAPT team and our presenters, we want to thank you for joining this webinar today, and have a great rest of your day.